Hi, guys. This is Mary Poplin with Office Hours with Boris FX. We're going to talk about removes today. So, what we're going to do is we're going to talk all about what are good removes, what are bad removes, and when you should use your remove tool and how. We're going to, I'm looking at the jokes in the chat and they're pretty funny. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss these topics and I'm going to show you examples. And we do these office hours every week. So every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, I'll be on here or one of my colleagues will be here answering your questions about Boris FX tools. Now, in general, it's going to be me. This is kind of my project right now. And we're going to talk often about Mocha, but also sometimes Continuum, sometimes Sapphire, and sometimes we'll talk about things like Silhouette, which is a really cool paint program. And I'm going to mention Silhouette a little bit today because some of the things I'm going to show you are going to be, well, you should probably paint that and not use the remove tool because a lot of times we have a problem where users don't really understand what the limitations of the remove tool are. So the remove tool is a really excellent tool, but it does have things that it needs in order to get a good solve. Now, I'm going to be answering your questions in the chat. So I'm going to keep glancing over here because this is where my second screen is, where I can see all of the questions that y'all are answering. The whole point of this is to answer your questions live as I'm working and to work on shots that have not been, canned. So we're going to work on shots on the fly and break down how to do them. And a lot of these shots I've never touched before. I've just downloaded them. In general, I tend to download them off of a website called Pexels. So if you haven't been to that site, it's a site for great free footage. And as long as you're respectful about how you treat the footage, you can use it to create plenty of visual effects. And if you want to follow any of my tutorials recently, I've been downloading my footage from there so that users can follow along, because the question I get a lot is, how do I find the footage you're using for this? Well, if I'm using free footage, you can too. So go to pexels.com and check that out. If you have any questions about our tools in general, you can go to borisfx.com, where I'm often on the forums during business hours during the week. I'm not going to answer, at 12 a.m. on a Saturday, but I'm usually around during the business hours, East Coast time on our forums, and you can ask questions there or here. Now, I'm going to switch over so that you can see my screen here. Let's go to, here we are. So let's talk a little bit about removes. So for those of you who have used Mocha before, you know that one of the things you can do with Mocha is you can track objects that are moving across the screen, look at the pixels moving behind them, and then you can go ahead and remove that object. And the way you remove it is by looking at the pixels behind the object. And I see here, Stephen says, great. I was hoping these streams would be about other tools other than just Mocha. And yes, some of them will be. A lot of the ones I do are going to be about Mocha because that tends to be my area of expertise, but we are going to have people like John on here from time to time. We might even get Ben on here from time to time. That's going to be in the future, and we'll advertise it as well so that you know what you're watching. All right, so back to the remove tool. So the remove tool is part of a module system in Mocha. So in Mocha, we have the tracking module, and then everything else is based off of the track. So obviously, if you don't have a good track on something, you're not going to get a good remove. I'm going to talk a little bit about the very basics of the remove module, and then we're going to dive into doing a shot from scratch. All right, so for this shot, let's go ahead and launch Mocha. And you can see that this host is not set to full resolution. That's because these are 4K plates. I'm streaming live and also demoing off of a laptop. So we're going to try to cut this down a little bit so that, we have some speed here while we're demoing. So we're going to just go ahead and hit continue. If you have a plate that you need maximum accuracy for, go ahead and switch it to 100% over here on your viewer. But if you don't, you can switch it to half res, or you can even switch it to quarter res, depending on what type of shot it is. So I see a question here with how to remove anything in stereo projects. So in stereo projects, you just have to set it up as a stereo project and you remove in the exact same way that I'm going to show you. And I can show you how to set up a stereo project when I'm done with this really quick, when I'm done explaining how the remove works. So the way the remove works in the first place, let's find there we go, is you have to have a foreground definition for what you want to remove. So in this case, we're going to try to remove these ladies here. And you can see that I've drawn a shape around them. All right. And this shape I didn't even track. I just kind of dragged it through the scene and made a couple of keyframes, 3 keyframes to get it through. Okay. So that's what we want to remove, but we need to remove it based on background information. So I've tracked this background, and let's just show you what this track looks like. You can see that the background is moving, but it's moving in a fairly planar way. There's not a lot of parallax happening in the background. All right, that is important. If you have a ton of parallax happening in your background, you're not going to get a good remove. Notice also that when I tracked the background, I made sure that my ladies were above my background. That means that while I track, they're held out from beneath the shape, right? So that I don't track their movement and the shadows when I'm tracking the background plate. Because I have good information for the foreground plate and for the background plate, and again, notice that I put every single moving thing into this shape. Let's turn this off. What I can do is I can click on my ladies, and I can actually just click on my remove. Let's turn my overlays off here, and I can hit render. And what Mocha will do is Mocha will look at all of the pixels over here, and all of the pixels that are behind these 2 ladies as they walk through the scene, and then it will rebuild the shot pixel by pixel based on that background motion, okay? And because this is based on a track, this is something that I can tweak. So let's say this doesn't look right or it looks off. I can always go into like adjust track, adjust my track, and then still use that background track as my remove. It gives you a lot of control. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what isn't a good remove. But the first thing I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to actually show you how to make a stereo shot. So let's go save and close real quick, because one of the questions was, how do we do a stereo shot? So when you apply your Mocha Pro effect in any host, if you have a stereo view, you would say, hey, stereo top or bottom, or stereo left and right is going, or 360 stereo is going to be your selection, okay? So you just make sure that you select the right kind of footage that you're bringing in, stereo top and bottom, or 360 stereo top and bottom, all right? Or a stereo file, okay? And you select that before you get started, before you do anything else, before you launch Mocha, before anything, because if you don't, it won't be set up as a stereo shot. For the standalone version of Mocha, you go File, New, and then you have the option to select a left eye and a right eye footage stream, and that's going to be how you make a stereo shot inside of the standalone. So thank you for asking about stereo. That's how you would do that, and then it's all you do when you're in a stereo shot is you have to make sure that you're tracking in stereo in the left and right eye. It's a checkbox, you know, and then as you're tracking, it will track the left and right eye together based on your shapes. So that's really all you have to do. There's no other tricksy sort of steps to it. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the things that would not be a good remove. Let's look at this shot. So let's say I wanted to remove a whole bunch of stuff from this shot. Let's say my director says to me, I don't like this cruise ship on this horizon. I don't like this sign over here. I'm not wild about these people moving through a scene. How do I get them out of here? My answer would be, oh my gosh, so much paint, okay? So what I would have to do if I wanted to remove these people is I'd have to patch this grass, and then I'd have to patch the people out, and I'd have to patch it out with moving water, because the ocean is moving, and we'd have to use things like clone stamps, you know, and we'd have to sort of composite these sort of sticks back over the top by painting them back over the top. This is not a good candidate for remove. We have way too many foreground objects, we've got way too much parallax, and we've got animated backgrounds. That's never the kind of thing you want to use in a remove. You want a planar background, you want lots of planar motion, which means not a lot of parallax. If you do have like mountains and a foreground, you can kind of get away with that, but there has to be a harsh line. You can't really have things like leaves and sticks going over the foreground and get a good remove without doing a whole bunch of work. It's the kind of thing that I would recommend starting using patches for and roto paint. And that's something that I would probably look at Silhouette to do. I would not use the remove tool for that. So this kind of shot, no, The other kind of shot I showed you, yes. And hopefully y'all understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these differences. You look how many overlapping pieces are in this scene. It would just be a nightmare. So same thing for like wire removals. You know, one of the questions I've had recently with a lot of folks is like, you know, how do I do a wire removal when I have this foreground object with like hair going over the wire? And man, that's RotoPaint. And if you want to watch a RotoPaint tutorial, Ben Brownlee did a 3-hour one that's on our website for Silhouette for specifically complex wire removal. It actually does use a little bit of the remove tool with Mocha, and then the rest he hand paints. And there's a reason for that. It's because you kind of want to save yourself as much work as possible, but you're still going to have to do some hand paint work to correct those types of shots. All right. I have a question here, which is, in most sessions when I'm doing roto, Mocha tends to slow down after a time. Is that because of the cache buildup? I usually save my project and open again, and that fixes it. Yes. What's your host? Are you using After Effects when you do that? Because if so, it probably is the cache. After Effects is always caching your footage, and that's desirable, right? Because it makes After Effects faster. But after a certain amount of time, your cache drive can fill up. Same thing for Mocha. If you're using the standalone to Roto, you can go to File and Clear Cache in Mocha. But if you're in After Effects, you actually have to come over here and you need to, well, you can still clear the cache in Mocha, but what you really need to do is go to Edit, and then Preferences, and then Media and Disk Cache, okay? And inside of Media and Disk Cache, you can actually delete your cache, and it will actually make, it will speed everything up a little bit. So that's right here, Empty Disk Cache, and you can even clean your database and cache if it's still being fussy, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about what could be a successful remove. So we talked about this remove, successful, okay? And we talked about the technique for it. So let's talk about a simple remove and how to get that started. And then we're going to talk about a slightly more complex remove. So we're going to talk about 2 removes today. 1, very simple. 2, not so simple. Okay, so I've never touched this shot before. So we're going to do this in real time, which is ideal. Let's come over here, drag and drop this right onto our timeline. We have Mocha Pro. Now this is a mono shot. It's not stereo, so we go ahead and leave it on mono. We're going to go to module renders. I'm sorry, not module renders. We're going to go to the Mocha Pro button, and we're going to launch Mocha Pro. There we go. Now, what this will do is this will read from my timeline, and you can see that it's full resolution. And it's going to take it a second to get this information from After Effects. Now, there is a pro and con when we're talking speeds to working inside of After Effects and using the plugin. If you are using the Mocha Pro standalone, the Mocha Pro standalone is a little bit faster because what it's doing is it's not having to path through a program. The part that slows you down is you have to render out of Mocha, then export that and import that into another piece of software if you're using the standalone. The benefit of using Mocha Pro as a plugin, and full disclosure here, I do not use the standalone anymore. I use the plugin for all of my work, and it's because it's a little bit more non-destructive and I don't have to render and then import it again and then composite all that together. What I tend to do is read from the timeline and then render to the timeline using the plugin. And then I can isolate my effect using Mocha masks and then apply other effects to them like degrains and regrains. It keeps everything live. Now, at the end, I do have to wait a little bit longer on my renders because now I have multiple stacks of effects on top of one another, but I didn't have to wait in the middle of my workflow. And I can just, for instance, send that to a render farm or, render that and walk away. So, 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. You want to make sure that you're saving time at the end of the process. All right. I see Steven saying, good to see you finally updated Mocha Pro. Haha. So a lot of times I'm using beta builds and they don't always register as the right version. So if you've seen me with Mocha telling me to update, it's because I'm usually using a test build and working on some future effects, like future, well, not effects, future features. There we go. So because, I work on the Mocha team and a little bit on the Silhouette team, I'm doing a lot of testing all the time. So if you've seen my stuff need to be updated, I'm sorry. That's because I'm switching between stuff all the time. All right. So if we want to remove this guy from this walkway, let's say narratively, the director decided, I don't want this guy in the shot. I'm going to just very quickly track his little backpack here. We're going to do translation only, and I'm going to hit track forward. And what Mocha's going to do is Mocha's going to follow his backpack. Now, why would I just do translation only? Well, I kind of want to be super lazy, and I don't want to do a whole lot of roto here. Now, I can either do this and stop this, and then I can use my Uber key and make my shape much bigger, just like this, and have it follow along. Or he's really pretty kind of in the middle of the scene. I probably don't have to actually do much roto if I roto him by hand. So this might be a good candidate to roto him by hand and just call that kind of a lazy garbage mat cheat. Now, I do want to make sure, once again, that I'm grabbing his shadow. Anytime you remove an object, one of the things I see users kind of skimp on, right, is they'll try to get as close to the person as possible. That is not always a good plan, because what you'll do is you'll end up losing hair on the background, or leaving hair on the background, and leaving shadows on the background, because even though it doesn't look like he's casting much of a shadow here, I promise you he is. Okay, so now we can just go ahead and scroll through this, and let's just adjust the shape. Oh, I'm on Uber key. Let's make an auto key, shall we? Show you the reason you want to turn auto key back on is because if you leave Uber key on, all you do is offset the shape and not make keyframes. Okay, here we go. It looks like he's always within that shot. Within that shape. Using the wrong words today. All right, so now he's always within that shape. Yay, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this guy remove, and we're going to track the background. I'm going to use one of my little primitive shapes here, and we're going to track. Let's actually delete that keyframe, and let's go to the end. Okay, there's a reason I want to go to the end, because he's walking forward. If I track from the end to the beginning, I will always have my shape in the middle of the screen. So now let's do one more thing. Let's go link to track and link to none, and let's call this BG track. What this is going to do, let's turn our track off on our guy. What this is going to do is, as usual, this is going to hold the guy out of our track as we track. So let's turn this red here for a second, just so you can see what's going on. Let's take our surface tool and let's align it to our ground plane, just like this. And now let's hit track backwards using perspective. And now what Mocha will do is Mocha will follow this ground track, all right, but it will not move my shape. So now my shape is going to stay around my guy, and my ground plane is going to track around him so that we don't leave his feet on the gravel, and so that we don't capture any part of him and leave it on the background. That's important because your track has to be accurate with removes. Now, a lot of times folks will think they can fudge it and get away with it. You can't. Notice how much room I have around my remove shape. Now, what's probably going to happen is, because my remove shape is so large, and because the guy is not really moving back and forth a lot on the road enough to replace him fully, we're probably going to have to make a clean plate. And I can talk about that as well. Let's go ahead and launch Photoshop. And I'm going to have Photoshop on standby so that I don't have to have you sit through launching this. Okay? Now, while we're tracking, we want to make sure that at no point does he cross this edge, because once again, that will give us a bad track. And everything in Mocha is based off the track. Stabilizations are based off the track, removes, clean plates, mega plates, inserts, camera solves, everything is based on the track. So in Mocha, our work order, let's minimize this, go back to Mocha. So in Mocha, our work order is clip. If you're in the standalone, you want to make sure your clip is correct. Lens, which is where you solve for any lens before you start tracking, okay? Track, where you track whatever it is in your scene you need to track based on what you're trying to do. And then adjust track, okay, if you have any adjustments you need to make to the track. Once all of those are complete, you can go to an output module. And an output module is the camera solver, the insert module, the mega plate module, remove module, stabilize, and reorient. So reorient is just for 360 if you've never used it before. So it's just a 360 stabilization. Now we're almost done tracking, and once we're done tracking, we're going to see how this remove looks. And like I said, I'm pretty sure this remove is not going to be a full remove because I don't have enough information to replace this guy with. Mocha can only work with the pixels you give it, and this is a good illustration of what that means. Computers give you the data out from the data you put in. If I don't have enough pixels to replace him, I won't have enough pixels in my clean plate to make a nice, pretty clean plate. And that's no problem. We can always paint something and put it in the background. All right. So that laptop deserves a cookie after this. I agree. I need to move to a tower, honestly, but we don't have a tower right now. We got a laptop. It is a pretty boss laptop, though. These laptops are from Dell, and I highly recommend them. This is a Dell Precision laptop, and it's definitely doing desktop workhorse work in a portable frame. So, and of course, we're using NVIDIA cards. All right, so now I have my lovely track. And if we want, we can even take our BG track and we can link it back to our shape so that you can see what this is doing better, right? But we don't want to do that. We want to leave our BG track at none, and here's why. Now, every time my guy moves, he's still within this shape. That matters. So if I have my BG track following my background, if I try to do a remove, anything where these two shapes overlap will not remove, okay? That's not what we want. We want the whole thing to remove. So we're going to go to link to track, none. And now my shape is over the whole background. So now I like to try to find an area where we have the most information. That's probably going to be the beginning here. And let's go over to our remove. Let's turn our overlays off. And let's click on our guy and say, hey, Mocha, I want you to remove him. So I click the render button, which in other modules, like the tracking module, is the track button, but in things like the remove module is a remove. We're going to hit remove, and we're going to chug away on this frame using GPU analysis, and we're going to see what it gets me. It might get me something that does not work. It might get me something that looks great. Okay, so we were able to remove most of the guy, but not all of the guy, okay? So now what do we do about that? Well, we paint it out. So let's go to create clean plate. Let's save this on our desktop. And we're going to go into our remove. We're going to save this as clean plate, remove, input 0, hit save. Back in Photoshop, we're going to go to open here. Remove office hours. Oh, wrong one. No, right one. Okay, and now we're going to select our clean plate input. All right. This says, we have a question here. It says, does the mask feather matter when you render a remove frame? No, mask feather does not matter in the remove, but it does matter in your comp. So if you want to comp your remove, it does matter. Another person says, Mocha tracking is very powerful and accurate. It saves me days and ease of my actual paint and prep work. I'm glad to hear it. All right. First thing we're going to do here is we are just going to have After Effects try to fill this in using content aware fill. We'll see what it does. Let's go to edit, fill, content aware. All right. It did its best, but it didn't quite do a nice enough job here in the middle. I feel like that looks obvious. So let's go to our healing brush tool and let's sort of heal this. Right. All right. We just don't want it to look sameish. Sameish is not even a word. We don't want it to look too repetitive, and we don't want it to look too like it pulled from the foreground instead of the background. Okay, so now that's a pretty good clean plate. Let's hit save on this. All right, notice we didn't add any new layers. Back in Mocha, we're going to say, let's make sure that our clean plate that we took from frame 0 is being put in at frame 0. If this says all, that's not good. We want frame 0, okay? And now let's use our clean plate exclusively, okay? And what that will do is that will now use our clean plate and then change the color based on how we're moving our clean plate around. If we go ahead and choose linear. So let's use a linear illumination modeling and use clean plates exclusively. Actually, let's see if we can get away with no blending. Let's hit render real quick. Okay, that looks good. Let's hit render here at the end. And let's turn our overlays off. Ooh, this is so evenly lit. We might get away with not using any. No, it's not. We're going to have to change it. Let's go to linear. All right. Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay, so we're going to use linear illumination modeling. We're going to save this, and we're going to close it. So we were just doing test renders at that point. Back over here in After Effects, okay, we're going to go to render our remove, and we're going to scroll through and see how this looks. Now, I can see a little bit of an edge. I don't like that edge. I see someone is saying, hello, hello. All right, we're going to duplicate this real quick. All right, and on my bottom layer, I'm going to delete Mocha Pro, and this is going to be my original plate. This is going to be my Mocha layer. Under our matte, we're going to hit Apply Matte, and we're going to select Visible Layers. So we're going to turn off our background track. So you see the I for background track is off, and the I for guy remove is on. And now we're going to feather this like 100 pixels. That's too many. Let's do 50. That's still too many. Let's do 20. There we go. All right, so now we have our remove. And it's rendering right back to our timeline. So this is a really quick and easy way to do a remove. If you really wanted to hide all of your sins, you could apply a degrain and regrain to this, or a match grain, whatever you like, and you'll hide any edges or, little artifacts that you might see. All right, so let's hit File and save this really quick. And let's go back to our project. I want to talk about one more thing, which is how do we start to handle shots when there's a foreground object, okay? So which shot do y'all want to look at? We can do this one, where we try to remove this fellow that is going between buildings over here, or we can remove this one, where we're trying to remove these folks over here in the background. I feel like this one is more visually impactful. What do you think? Blue shot or palace shot? I'm gonna give y'all a second to answer. And let me know in the comments. I'm seeing no answers. Okay. If so, I'm going to pick the blue shot. All right, I picked blue. All right. I'm seeing one vote for. Okay. I'm seeing blue shot. Very good. Okay. So let's go ahead and drag and drop Mocha to this. Let's go ahead and duplicate this so that we have a background plate and a foreground plate, and let's drag Mocha Pro onto it. All right. And let's launch Mocha. We have a couple of things that we're going to have to do to fix this shot. Let's let Mocha launch. Here we are. Okay. First thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to look at this shot and plan it. All right. So I want to get rid of the guy walking. I can see that there's a foreground building, and I can see that there's two foreground buildings and then a pan up. All right. So how are we going to handle that? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. The first thing we need to do, as ever, what do I always say? Work from the foreground to the background. Okay, so we're going to want to isolate the foreground from the background. So I'm going to take my magnetic spline tool, magnetic spline tool, and I'm going to want to follow this foreground wall. Just like this. And then I click and drag to draw a nice little shape. So that's my foreground shape. Lovely, lovely. We're going to relax these curves a little bit so they're not quite so harsh. And there we are. Now, the next thing we're going to do is do the same thing right over here. We're going to use our magnetic spline tool. And I'm going to select this wall here. And there's a nice contrast edge, which is very helpful. I love it when that happens. And actually, let me pull off these points over here. There we go. I want this nice wall tracked over here. All right. So we're going to call this mid wall, and we're going to call this foreground wall. Okay. Now, midground and foreground wall are going to need to be tracked. So let's go ahead and let them track really quick. And I'm probably not going to track this whole scene. Where's my, yeah, we're going to track to about here. I don't want to track my whole scene because that's just going to be a waste of time. So let's actually just trim our scene all the way down to here. All right, so that's our, yeah, that's going to be our scene. So let's hit track forwards. So we're tracking 154 frames as opposed to tracking just a zillion frames. And the reason we're tracking these first is because if we do not have these holdout shapes, we are not going to get an accurate track on that background. Now that is always important in Mocha. You always have to work from the foreground to the background. And if you work from the foreground to the background, you will always have holdout mats for everything beneath that layer. It's a really important workflow in Mocha. It's a feature and not a bug. If you've ever been tracking in Mocha and you've had a foreground shape occlude a background shape and the track is shot off the screen, that is a feature, not a bug. You need to make that smaller shape above the larger shape if it's moving in front of the other shape. So if you've ever seen that happen, that would explain that. Now notice I am tracking these in perspective. That's because these are buildings. Normally, you might be able to get away with tracking, things in for rotoscoping in translation, scale, and rotation, or translation only. For these buildings, though, I don't think I'm going to get away with that because I think we are seeing a little bit of a tilt up. Anytime you have that tilt in Z space, you're going to want to use perspective. Okay, so that's important. Now, when you are doing those things, you always want to think about how you're tracking and why. With Mocha, like I said before, it's good input, good output, bad input, bad output. Okay, so you always have to think about what you're telling the computer to do. It's a computer. It does exactly what you tell it to do. And that is the pro and con of computers, right? So anytime you tell a machine to do something, the instructions need to be precise, which is why we have all of these options in our tracking options. Sometimes you only need perspective. I mean, sometimes you only need translation, but other times you do need perspective. And for things like walls, you're going to need them. Now, I want to make sure that I point something out about this shot, and that is that foreground wall is not really very blurry. That's important. If that wall was super, super blurry, we'd probably have to want to try to remove as much of the wall as possible and then patch it back in with a feather. You can't get away with removing something behind a blurry edge without making that edge hard. And the reason for that is because imagine you don't really have those pixels to replace anymore because they're contaminated with a foreground object. Every time you do removes, you have to think about how is the remove going to be contaminated, right, by the pixel data around it, because it's just reading pure pixel data in and pure pixel data out. It's not doing any sort of machine learning. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's doing a simple process of where are these pixels in relation to the track? How do we rebuild those pixels in relation to the track? Does that make sense? I'm hoping it does. If you have any more questions, again, please feel free to ask them in the chat and I will answer. If you have never seen this before, what we are doing is we are doing office hours with Boris FX. I am Mary Poplin, and I do this every Tuesday for about an hour, starting at 1 p.m. EST. You can come in, answer questions, and we'll talk about the topic of the day. If you have any footage you'd like for me to go over that you can share, send it to me at maryp at borisfx.com. And what we'll do is the next office hours or the next time I can fit it in, I will take your footage and I will go over it in detail in office hours and explain how I would fix that shot. So think of it as a clip clinic as well. You have access to all of my knowledge and all of my experience at this company for the last gazillion years. I don't want to actually say how many years it's been. It's been over 10 with Mocha. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that I can share all of the knowledge that I have with you. Now, we will be doing these every single week, so like and subscribe. All right. Scrolling back, that looks really nice. Both of those walls are very well tracked. We're going to take the gear and turn it off because we don't want to track them anymore. And let's come in here and let's draw a quick garbage mask around this guy. There is no need to track this fellow. He is unnecessary for tracking, all right, because we can just scroll right through this scene. But I do want to make sure that I cover his whole body, okay? Now, let's make some keyframes. Keyframe, keyframe. Garbage mats. All right, so again, you see we're leaving that heel on the background. We do not want to leave that heel on the background. We want to make sure that we cover it at all times. All right. And that shadow. Okay, that looks good. Now backwards. All the way to here. Now, here we are. Hand roto is so exciting to watch. All right. We always want to make sure that we cover whatever part of him is peeking out from the wall. And we want to make sure that we grab whatever foot motion is happening. Okay. All right, so we've got this guy moving through our scene. So he's tracked. Let's call him Guy Remove. And let's drag and drop him underneath mid-wall and foreground wall. Let's put foreground wall at the top. All right, so we have foreground wall, midground wall, Guy Remove. Notice that they are all in a row. Okay, they're all relative to the front plane of the camera. In case, like you mentioned, with a blurred foreground element, would it be best to freeze it, track it, and maybe scale it a bit and feather it and try to fake it? Yeah, you can try that. Totally. Like you can also just make a patch that's static to put over the top if you have a blurry foreground element. There's a million ways to skin that cat. You can also use the clone tool to increase the edge. You can try color erode. There are many, many, many ways to try to remove to try to add back in over the top of a remove. But I'd still use a patch for the background because if you try to pull from those blurry pixels, your whole background is going to be problematically blurred. Okay, so you'll still have to patch where those pixels are transparent no matter what. And you're unlikely to be able to patch, you're unlikely going to be able to remove into the foreground object to do that. And I hope that makes sense. So patches work better for that. If you go to our website, I actually have a tutorial on that. It's a remove microphone that's between a foreground woman who has quite a lot of blur on her. What we did instead of doing the remove tool is we used the insert module instead. And that is a much better workflow for that kind of problem. If this foreground were super blurry, I would just patch this whole background in one piece and hope that nobody noticed. So, all right, so now we've got our guy. And now we want to do one more thing, which is the important thing. This is the part that makes this work. Okay, we're going to have to track that background. I can also see that my foreground is slipping a little bit. So let's correct this roto shape. All right, because we want to make sure that we get that background wall and that it is tracked correctly. All right, so now what I can do is I can track this background. All right. Can you import SF silhouette shapes into Mocha? Yeah, you can, but it'll leave a keyframe on every frame. It won't be tracked. So you can import silhouette frames though. Let's go ahead and track this background here. I'm going to just track this little area here for the background real quick. We're going to drag this underneath and we're going to call this BG track. I want to do one more thing here, which is add to X-spline. And I want to make sure that I'm grabbing a little bit of this wall up here at the top. All right, now notice when I click on my mat here that we're tracking this wall at the top and this wall at the bottom. Why wouldn't we try to track this whole area? Well, if you look, we have a sign that's at a 90-degree angle to the wall. We're still going to see what we can get away with the ground plane. If we have to, we might have to track the ground plane. And we think we can get away with parallax on this potted plant, even though it's technically on a separate plane. But I think we can get away with it because it's so fast. But I need to track this wall up here at the top because when he moves over this shape, he's going to move over too much of this wall and ground to track properly. So let's track all of these together. Let's turn our guy remove off, turn our surface tool on. Let's take our surface tool. Let's align it to this wall here, just like this. And now let's track translation, scale, rotation, shear, and perspective. Wouldn't it be better to track the window than the wall? No. If you look at this window has a plane coming out at a 45-degree angle from the wall. It's also got another 45-degree angle here. It's got some parallax happening inside the window frame, and it's got a power line moving on top of it. I would track the wall instead. So that's why. Now let's go ahead and hit track forwards. And let that do its thing. So whenever you're tracking objects inside of Mocha, yes, you do want to track areas of the most texture. So like Juan's asking a really good question here, which is, wouldn't it be better to track the window than the wall? And I say no. And the reason I say no is because that window is extremely multiplanar. And you want, whenever possible, to track one plane at a time. Okay, the texture is good, but the texture on the wall is enough texture to track. It's actually a pretty modeled wall. It's a pretty modeled wall. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of something. I've been talking a lot. Have some tea. Okay, so the wall is one plane, and it's got a really nice stucco texture on it. But if I try to just track the window, I have multiplanar interference. And I could maybe get away with it. You know, it really depends on how much parallax is happening and how much parallax Mocha sees. And I love to try to get away with things, but we don't always get away with stuff like that. And we want to make sure that when we are tracking, that we give Mocha as much information as it can get that's from one plane only. All right, I'm glad we understand that. Perfect. And that's a really good question. So thank you for asking that. Now, as this tracks, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to what the surface tool is doing because, as I've said before, and I keep driving this home for every single talk that we have, that shape is only where the track is looking, okay? The surface tool is what the track is doing. And a lot of times users mistake the two. They'll think if they move the shape, they're moving the track. You're not. You're telling Mocha to look into the shape, see all the pixels moving through that shape, and then mathematically decide how those pixels are moving. That math is then stored inside of Mocha, and then we use the surface tool to translate it from computer math to something visual that we can see and use and move around. However we move, that surface tool is going to move relative to that track. So everything in Mocha is a child of the track, which is just a fancy way of saying everything in Mocha is linked to the track, including the shape. So unless you unlink it like I did earlier. So what happens is Mocha's looking at the track and it says, okay, it's looking at the texture. It says, okay, on this frame, this texture is moving in this way. Let's jump to the next frame and see if we can tell how that texture is changing over time. Now, let's jump to the next frame and see how that texture is changing over time. And it gets to a certain series of frames where it's checked the texture, and then it goes back over that and says, okay, how is this moving over time collectively? And that's how it gets the data. All right. And once it has that data is pretty hard to understand because it's, you know, essentially 2.5D geometric data. And we want to get that data into something that we can use, like a corner pin or a transform tool. So we have this surface tool, which is it's basically a translation tool that says these 4 corners are going to be your corner pin, and this center point would be your transform. And it also has a nice visual representation to see whether or not your track looks correct. There's a couple other things you can do to check and see if your track is correct. For instance, we can hit this auto stabilize or quick stabilize mode. What that will do is that will pin our object right in the middle of the scene based on our track. It's another good way to check the track. So let's pin this really quick once we're done tracking, and let's scroll through. And if that stays in place, we know our track is halfway decent. So it feels like it's sticking in place pretty good, okay? I can see that that surface tool is nice and pinned. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to click on our guy and we're gonna see how he removes. So let's turn our pin off. Let's hit save. And I just really quickly want to save and close this. And I want to save before I start rendering, because sometimes After Effects doesn't like when I ask it to stream and render at the same time while also processing 4K video. So let's go ahead and launch Mocha again before we hit render. Let's see, here we are. The reason I saved the After Effects file is because in Mocha, you're actually not saved in the plugin until you have saved the After Effects file. All right, so jumping over here, there we are. Here's our guy remove. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna hit render forwards. So let's turn our overlays off and let's check this render. Hit render forwards and see what it does. The little laptop that could. No kidding. All right, so, and once again, these are Dell laptops. They're a sponsor of ours, and yeah, these are pretty boss little laptops. I use them for all my demos because obviously, you know, in the past, I've had to travel a lot for demos and do live demos, obviously, since that's the before times, because we're living in COVID times now. But back when I was still traveling a lot, I had to have a portable desktop level computer to take with me, which is where this little laptop that could came into the picture. And I can see that I'm still not removing my guy very well. He's not really removing as well as I'd like, probably because there's not enough information. So this is another one of those times where I would maybe find a good central point, see what can be removed. Okay, it did an okay job. And now what I can do is I can try to use this as a clean plate and clean it up. So now what we can do is we can hit create clean plate and we can save this. So on our desktop, let's go to our remove office hours and we're going to call this clean plate remove input 83. There we go. Let's open the file. Let's see, it's 83. And now let's do a little bit of footage doctoring. All right, so now we're going to come over here and let's do a little bit of our favorite tool. This is my favorite tool, which is the heal tool. When you just don't want to paint, when you just want to be lazy, there's the heal tool. Ah, my friend, the lazy, lazy heal tool. All right, so here we are. All it does is it replaces texture, you know, based on what it's seeing and based on the hues and values around it. Okay, so there's my lovely little healed shot. We're going to hit save. And now we're going to go back over to Mocha. All right, so now we're going to use clean plates exclusively. And I'm going to do one more thing, which is I'm going to use interpolate because I can see that there's a lot of subtle visual changes happening over here. So let's hit interpolate. And now when I hit render, I get a much better remove. Okay, so now if I save and close this, back inside of After Effects, we can go down to our module renders and we can go to render and remove. And we end up with a remove. That's a lot nicer. Oh, looks like we're still losing our guy here. So let's figure out why that is. We want to use clean plates exclusively. Oh, it may be that it doesn't think it has that information because of the background. So I have something to fix its red wagon. Let's go back here and let's hit remove. Let's hit create clean plate and save it. Let's go over here. We're basically tricking Mocha. Let's say create clean plate and save that. So now let's say remove using those clean plates. And again, this is troubleshooting on the fly because I've never touched this shot before until just now. So what we're doing is we're showing you how to troubleshoot a shot. So I didn't have enough clean plate from the middle to deal with the parallax that was happening behind the wall. To get around that, I made a clean plate earlier in the scene where the guy was not visible. And I used that as one of the clean plates to blend between in my shot. And I did the same thing at the end. So now we should actually end up with a little bit better remove because what we're going to be doing is we're blending between 3 clean plates. But we only had to paint one of those clean plates. So we're cheating a little bit. And if ever you need to cheat on a shot, that's a good way to do it. The other good way to do it is if you don't have that information, you can still use the clean plate. You can hit render. You can have Mocha try to remove as much of it as possible. And then you can try to clean up from there. So in this case, we still may have a little bit of cleanup that we need to do, but let's see how this renders. We still do have a little bit of cleanup we need to do because it's still missing this data, or it thinks it is. Now, that being said, we can also try this where we say instead of frames before and frames after, we say look only at frames after. So in this case, we can say 0 frames before and 608 frames after. And let's see if we get a better remove from that, because sometimes that will give us better results. It doesn't. Looks like the way to beat this shot is just to do a whole bunch of plates, which is not exciting, but probably the way it's going to have to be. So in this case, it looks like the solution to this remove is make a bunch of plates and blend them all together based on the track. Not ideal, but it's also because there's not as much information to remove him. And we have quite a lot of shape to deal with. We could also try coming into our shape, turning this on, zooming in, and doing a little bit better roto. So we can come in here and we can shave this shape in quite a bit. Just like this. Many ways to troubleshoot this. All right. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing here. Oh my goodness. Oh, rookie mistake. You hate to see it. All right. My background shape. Just on the fly, I wasn't paying attention here. My background shape is only this big. Remember earlier how I said we wouldn't remove anything if the background shape didn't cover it? Very good. So what we're going to do is we're going to expand that. We're going to click our Uber key. How to troubleshoot on the fly when you're talking and demoing and chewing bubblegum at the same time. The background does need to be bigger. You're correct. So now the background shape is bigger. I bet our remove's going to work now. So let's go ahead and turn our overlays off, turn our mats off, and let's hit render forwards. Oh, come on. Guy remove. Hit render. Look at that. Unsurprisingly, that's a better remove because the shape is the proper size. Because after I tracked, I didn't expand my background shape. It was a step I missed because, well, I was chattering and I missed it. But it's a good illustration of how to troubleshoot your shot. And, you know, when maybe if you're not paying attention, your remove doesn't work like I just did. So that face of relief. Yes. Also, I tend to emote in my face. Yes. So there we go. I was just like, odd. It should work. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because simple mistakes. But that's good because, you know, when we have mistakes, we can show how to fix them. And honestly, that's a mistake I see users make all the time because it's a really easy mistake to make. And it's really easy to miss, as evidenced by this right now. So we're going to hit save. We're going to stop this, hit save. Yes, I know I canceled. Hit save and close, and then back in After Effects, we can render this right back to our timeline. So that's how to do a slightly more complicated remove in Mocha. So what did we do? We did our foreground shapes, tracked those first, okay? Second step, shape around the guy. Made it really nice and loose, okay? Third step, let's change that blending mode. Okay, when you're using interpolate and you have something going over the foreground, sometimes it doesn't work as nice. Let's go ahead and show you how to get rid of that. I animated that, so I have to go into my dope sheet. I go into my guy remove. We're going to go into our remove, and we're going to go into our illumination modeling. We're going to look for any keyframes that we have under illumination modeling right here. Delete them. Go to our parameters, guy remove, Uber key, and we're going to do none. Okay, now hit render. There we go. Now save and close. Okay, that looks way better. Way better. Okay, so illumination modeling will pull information, color information from the objects that are moving around it. If your roto isn't perfectly to the edge of something, sometimes a foreground object will contaminate that illumination modeling, and you'll end up with a modeling sparkle that moves through your remove. That sparkle is not desirable. It's kind of a predator effect, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is now we can see that this remove works, and we could blend this back in with feathering or anything else that we wanted to do. And I think I will feather it. Let's actually come over to our matte. Let's go apply matte. Let's do a feather of 15 pixels. And let's do visible layers and do our guy only. There we are. And hit OK. All right, let's do 20. All right, much nicer. So that's a much nicer remove. And yeah, everybody makes mistakes. And it's good to make mistakes because that's how you learn. All right. If anybody has any more questions, we are running out of time. We have 3 minutes left. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe to this so that you can get these in the future. We're going to be doing these every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm Mary Poplin with Boris FX. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. You can always find me on our forums during business hours, and you can always give me footage that you're working on if it's available to be shown. And of course, I understand that NDA is a thing, and if you can't show it, you can't show it. But you can also email me with the problem you're having, and I can try to find a similar looking shot and see if I can show you the breakdown of that. And we'll put that in the next office hours or whenever we have time. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope that this was helpful and that you enjoyed it. I hope it helped you understand the differences between when you need to use a patch, when you need to use paint, when you need to use remove, and then how to troubleshoot those removes as you go. And once again, like this shot, I did not touch this shot until today, because I wanted to go over it with you live, and I wanted to be able to show you exactly how I break down fixing a shot and working on it from scratch. That's the benefit of these talks. All right. If you have any more questions, I'm going to look in the little panel here. Otherwise, I'm going to end because we've got about 2 minutes left. Let's see. It seems like maybe I did answer everybody's questions, and that's good. Oh, still some ghosting. How would you fix that? If there's still some ghosting, you know what I'd do? I'd widen the shape because what that ghosting is probably from, if I come in here onto this shot, it's probably from his shadow being cast on the wall. So what I would want to do is make the shape bigger so that that shadow did not get passed on the wall. So let's go in here, go to guy remove, and let's use Uber key, and let's make this bigger, just like this. Save and close. And yeah. And then what I'd do is I'd fix the roto on this wall here. So, yep, that's how I would fix that. Let's work on a bigger shape so that you didn't have as much of a shadow on the wall. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. And like I said, if you have any trouble, email me at maryp@borisfx.com.